The evening was bound to be boring, and the mandatory corporate events were one of Emily's most unpopular aspects of her job, and she wasn't used to idle conversation, especially when the party was mostly co-workers and couples sitting on their hands. She came alone because Steve, her husband, was late again at work, which she had been comfortable with. Steve was one of those men who could be relied on, who always aimed for success. Steve's ambitions became for Emily not only a magnet, but also a symbol of confidence in the future. But now she was increasingly irritated by his desire for career heights at the cost of their personal communication. She knew she missed the ordinary things, the evenings together, the conversations, the smiles that they once had, and she ran her eyes around the room, thinking she could stay out of it by just staying close to the other staff and pretending to be actively involved in the conversation. But fate seemed to have decided otherwise. Her attention was drawn to a new colleague, Tom, standing at the bar with a drink in his hand. He was tall, well-groomed, and possessed of something elusively attractive, a confidence that didn't need to be overstated. When their eyes met, Tom smiled. That smile was sincere and warm, as if they had known each other for a long time. Emily realized that he was easy to distinguish from the other colleagues in his behavior, and in his eyes there was a lightness that she lacked. "Emily, right?" He began as he got a little closer. His voice was soft, but with a tinge of curiosity. She nodded, feeling awkward mixed with some pleasant excitement. The conversation began simply by discussing work, colleagues, and current projects, but Emily suddenly noticed how clever Tom was in putting accents, including jokes and light compliments. She smiled and replied, feeling the warmth in her chest. She felt like she was being really listened to for the first time in a long time. Tom was an interesting person to talk to. He was skilled at asking questions, almost imperceptibly guiding the conversation, and soon they were talking about things that were far from work. Emily unwittingly opened up about her passion for art, about plans that had once been but had not been realized. Tom listened to her so carefully that she felt a slight embarrassment. When was the last time Steve listened to me with such interest? She thought. Tom laughed in response to her story about another failed attempt at painting, and that laughter awakened something in her that she hadn't felt for a long time. "Well, you could say hidden," she laughed, feeling the embarrassment disappear, giving way to inner pleasure. It seemed like everything around her, the loud music, the conversation, the laughter of the colleagues, was gradually fading into the background, leaving her alone with Tom. Emily suddenly said, leaning a little closer, "It may sound strange, but somehow it feels like we've known each other for a long time." Emily didn't know how to react. He looked at her as if he could see through her, as if he could read her mind. Inside, she wanted to answer that she felt the same way, but the words stuck in her throat. She felt her heart beating faster, and a feeling pouring out of her chest that she was trying to suppress. For a moment, she even looked away, hoping that someone would interrupt their conversation. But Tom waited in silence, with a slight smile, as if this was the answer he was looking for. He kept looking, and she suddenly realized that she didn't want to turn away anymore. With a slight nod, Emily replied, It's probably just because you have a talent for making people happy." Tom raised his eyebrow a little and smiled, satisfied with her words, as if this was the answer he was waiting for. The compliment was in the air, and with it came the tension that was hidden beneath their conversation, and Emily couldn't remember the last time she felt something like this with her husband. And the time was flying by, and she didn't notice the glass of wine was empty, and the evening was slipping into the night, and she was trying to come to her senses and try to bring herself back to reality by remembering Steve. She was overcome with guilt, a slight but still palpable feeling. She loved her husband, but how difficult it was to ignore those feelings. As the evening drew to a close, Emily realized she didn't know how to leave. She felt she probably should, but her legs were stretched to the floor. Tom caught her gaze and said softly, "It would be a pity if this evening ended so easily." Emily, caught in this inner struggle, couldn't find the strength to answer. She nodded, saying goodbye, but she knew inside that the thread that had been drawn between them would not be broken so easily. Trying to get her mind off Tom, she went home, hoping that the morning would set things right. But something inside her told her that after that evening, her life would never be the same. In the morning, Emily tried to get back to her usual routine, but her thoughts persisted in returning to talking to Tom. She felt a slight anxiety and a strange anticipation as she dressed for the office again, choosing a slightly bolder dress than usual, as if the echo of last night still haunted her. She thought about how their house was becoming more and more empty, as if their lives were gradually falling apart, taking away the warmth and simple joys. In the office, things looked completely different. Tom was already there and saw her immediately when she entered the office. He greeted her with a short nod and a smile, but his eyes were attentive, as if he were waiting for a signal. It was almost unnoticed, but Emily caught it, and during the lunch break she was again by his side, this time without any outside eyes, in a secluded corner of the cafeteria where other coworkers rarely went. Tom came up without saying a word, but his eyes gave a hint. "So you decided to meet him anyway?" He smiled, sat down next to me, and continued the conversation with ease, as if he and Emily had known each other for years. "I was afraid you'd be scared. It's just that people are afraid of consequences and never even talk about it." Emily felt something upset inside her, but she couldn't back down. She smiled, trying to hide her inner insecurity. "Honestly, I'm surprised myself," she replied. "Maybe it's just the aftermath of yesterday's wine, but maybe there's something else." Tom leaned a little closer and looked at her with the same alluring interest that made her feel wanted. "Sometimes we miss the simplest things," he said softly, as if guessing her thoughts. "We forget about ourselves and everything that once mattered because life is filled with routine." Emily held her breath, and there was something dangerous in what he was saying, like a quiet whisper that was going around in an empty room, and she didn't know why she kept listening. But she was drawn to the conversation, to what they both had quietly admitted. It was unbearably easy for her to talk to him about things that seemed impossible to even think about. Suddenly Tom touched her hand carefully, as if checking her reaction, and Emily felt like a wave overwhelming her from the inside. For a moment it seemed to her that they were alone here, and that everything that had happened before didn't matter. She couldn't take her hand away. She didn't want to take it away, and this moment seemed to be the break she had been afraid of, but couldn't avoid. "Emily," Tom whispered, looking into her eyes, "tell me honestly, do you feel it too?" She knew she had to stop right now, but her body and mind were no longer listening. It was a signal that her life would never be the same again. And in that moment, she realized that the thought of returning to her cold, alienated relationship with Steve was filling her with bitter despair. She breathed heavily as she was about to answer, but Tom spoke first. "Haven't you been feeling happy for a long time?" he asked quietly, looking her straight in the eye. Emily felt her heart beating from these words, from this almost physical confirmation of her own thoughts. And before she could find an answer, Tom said, "Let's just talk. As friends." Over the next few days, these conversations became something of a little secret. They only talked privately, and every time Emily felt something bigger growing between them. She tried to hold on, not cross the line, but Tom seemed to know that he was holding her, and he deftly bypassed any attempt she might have made to limit communication. Gradually, her anxiety subsided, giving way to that new feeling she hadn't felt for a long time, a feeling of freedom. One evening, when they were again in the empty office, he came so close to her that she could feel his breath. All that remained in her mind was the thought that she and Steve had once stood in the same way in the very early days of their relationship. But now she couldn't remember the last time her husband had looked at her so carefully, with such tenderness and interest. Tom, as if sensing her confusion, gently touched her shoulder and said quietly, "Are you afraid?" Emily tried to smile, to hide her inner uncertainty, but it was harder than she expected. "I'm not afraid," she replied quietly, without looking away. "I just don't know what's going to happen next." Tom nodded, carefully studying her face. His eyes seemed to be looking for a resolution in her gaze, and when she finally nodded, he stepped over and gently hugged her. It was just a moment. It was as if in that moment she had allowed herself to do something that she had been afraid to even think about for a long time. And the next day, Emily came back to work feeling like her life was starting to change, and she was excited and scared, but at the same time, unusually happy. Tom was in the office as usual, greeting her with a light smile that spoke more than words. It seemed that none of the colleagues noticed their secret conversation, but she was tormented by guilt. No matter how hard she tried to convince herself that it was just a friendly flirt, she knew deep down that their meeting meant something more. It was like an escape from her tired life, the escape she had been looking for. By the evening, she had decided to stay at work. And of course Tom had stayed with her. That evening they had talked for the first time for a long time, touching on the most personal topics, as if there were no prohibitions between them. When she was about to leave, Tom came closer again, and this time his touch was even more insistent. Her heart was pounding harder, and she closed her eyes for a second, letting herself forget everything, knowing that this moment could be the decisive one, and that all that would remain was either regret or new feelings. But Emily could never let go of those feelings, and she forced herself to step back, knowing that once she crossed the line, she would never be able to go back. She tried to start, but Tom stopped her with a slight gesture. "Don't say anything," he said softly. "Just know that I'm here if you want to make a difference." Those words were ringing in her head for a long time as she walked home, feeling that her whole life had changed in those few minutes. That night, she couldn't sleep, and all she could see was Tom's face and his words that made her heart beat faster. The next few days were a painful dance on the edge for Emily. By day, she tried to concentrate on her work, on every action, so as not to give her co-workers or herself any reason to notice that something had changed. But no matter how hard she tried, every time she met Tom, she was filled with tension and uncertain expectations. And no matter how much she wanted to forget, her mind kept coming back to their recent conversations and looks, and he acted as if nothing had ever happened between them. He was polite, courteous, and professional, but they had to be alone whether it was accidental or intentional how they were getting the tension that Emily was afraid of and wanted at the same time. A few days after their last conversation, Emily was late for work again. Steve was busy, as usual, and they barely spoke. That night, he sent her a text. "Don't wait. I'll be late." And Emily felt a relief on one side, and a deafening disappointment on the other that their marriage had now come to mean such empty phrases. And that fear wasn't that she had done something wrong, but that her life had turned out to be something she had never dreamed of, and then suddenly she heard footsteps, gentle, cautious, but recognizable. And Tom appeared at the door, his silhouette in the office's half-darkness. He smiled and, without asking, came closer, as if he knew she was waiting for him right here, right now. "Emily, are you all right?" he asked, leaning slightly toward her, and Emily felt someone approach her throat. Yes, she tried to suppress her smile, but her voice was tense. It's we're being here alone at this late hour." Tom looked at her carefully, as if he was thinking about something. Then, gently taking her hand, he said, "Sometimes being alone is harder than it seems, especially when you feel like no one understands you." Emily felt Tom's words penetrate the depths of her soul. Her eyes were wet involuntarily, and she turned to avoid his noticing it. But Tom seemed to sense her confusion and not let go of her hand. Their eyes met, and in that moment it seemed to her that he was the only one who understood her as no one else did. "Why do you care so much?" Tom laughed quietly, but there was more to his laughter than a simple answer. He took her hand again, tighter than before, and his voice became serious. "Sometimes I feel like I've known you all my life, Emily. I don't know why, but I feel very close to you." Those words were the last straw. Emily, uncontrollably, stepped forward and embraced him, forgetting everything, and she felt his arms gently embracing her as he held her close to him. And in that moment a wave of the tranquility she had so longed for overwhelmed her soul. It was both frightening and comforting, and Tom gently put his hand over her hair, and Emily felt that there was no haste in his touch, only care and understanding, and she couldn't remember the last time she felt something like that. Everything that happened between them seemed perfectly natural, as if they both knew it was going to happen, and they stood in silence for a long time, clutching each other until Emily finally realized that it could be real, and her heart was filled with conflicting feelings, and she wanted it to last forever, but she was consumed by guilt. How could she afford to go so far? After all, Steve was still her husband, and they were still together, even at a distance. Emily felt her mind and heart begin to struggle, and at the last moment she pulled away, breathing out, as if she had just woken from a dream. That's not right. Tom looked down, but he didn't let go of her hand. He kept silent as if he respected her decision, but Emily read something more in his eyes. Something that said he wasn't going to back down so easily. Every time we talk, I know it's something important, and his words are stuck in her mind, but Emily knows she can't keep it together if she keeps talking. She needed to put an end to it before it got too far. "Sorry, Tom," she said, not being able to meet his gaze, "but I have to go home." He slowly let go of her hand, and she, without looking back, went to the exit, feeling the heart racing in her chest. Her every step echoed in the empty office, and when she finally stepped outside, she was overcome with relief, mixed with regret, and all the way home, she was thinking about what she had almost done, and it was as if this moment had revealed all her dissatisfaction and loneliness. But instead of resolving it, it brought more questions. She knew she had to find the strength to stop, but she also knew it might be harder than she thought. When she got home, Steve was asleep on the couch, immersed in the endless world of work. Emily stood watching him, and for the first time in a long time, she was overcome by an unspoken sense of bitterness. This man was everything to her, and now he had become a stranger, a distant man, with whom she had nothing but formal promises. The next day, she met Tom again at work. They didn't say a word about that night, and their interaction became a little more formal. But when they met, Emily saw that he still remembered, and that everything that had happened between them was just the beginning. And despite all her efforts to distance herself, she knew that the spark would not be easily extinguished. Emily could not shake her obsessive thoughts about Tom. They never spoke to him about that evening, but their casual glances, each brief smile, the barely noticeable hint of words, all seemed to pierce her, and the weight of these secret encounters and mutual understanding, which had come about in an instant, became unbearable, and Emily did not know where this game would lead her. His serious face, as always, remained focused on something of his own, far away, not noticing the changes around him. He smiled tiredly, but his gaze was distracted, and the affectionate touch on her shoulder was somehow empty, not causing any emotion. Emily held her breath and realized that something important was missing in her presence. She was no longer the girl who needed only peace, security, and confidence, but she was also tormented by guilt, and she knew that she wasn't really ready to destroy her life for the secret connection that was deepening between her and Tom. And she wanted those feelings to go away and to be the way they were, but the more she tried to forget about Tom, the more she was drawn to him. And every time she saw him, it only made her want to go back and reminded her how long she had been in this state of emptiness. And one night, Emily couldn't sleep, and she got up quietly, leaving Steve asleep, and went into the living room, and her eyes fell on an old photo album on the shelf, and she couldn't help but pick it up. She wanted to remember what their lives were like, and she looked at the pictures, and she saw the happy, smiling faces. She and Steve on their first trip together, their wedding day, the friends and family they celebrated with. She was first gripped by the warmth of memories, but with each page, it was replaced by a sense of loss, as if those photos were still frames from a movie that had long since ended. They were them, but now she looked at those images as strangers, not knowing how to find a way back to the feelings that had once bound them. Steve was so caring, so close and family. He could listen to her stories about her work, he could always support her ideas, he could even inspire new ones. He wasn't just her husband, he was her friend, he was her support. She wondered how their lives had changed so much. When did this happen? When did his career and endless affairs take him away from her? Her heart was aching, and at the same time, she was wondering, could she ever get back to what it was? Or was their connection forever left on these pages of the album, like a reminder that everything they had was gone? The next day, she met Tom at the elevator, standing there with the same light expression of calm confidence that she loved so much about him. Emily felt that Tom was feeling her condition, her inner struggle, and she saw in his eyes the support she had been looking for, and at some point she wanted to tell him about her doubts, about her lost connection with her husband, about her loneliness. "You're worried, aren't you?" Emily nodded, wondering how easily he could understand her mood, as if he could see through her. "It's just a strange feeling," she said quietly, picking words. "Sometimes it seems like life just passes by, and then you realize you're not the person you used to be, and that someone you cared about suddenly became so distant." Tom listened attentively, without interrupting. He knew that these words came from the depths of her soul, and he knew that he just needed to be there. Sometimes you need to share to know that you're not alone, and those words were like a breath of fresh air to her, and her heart beat faster, but this time not out of fear, but out of the feeling that someone finally understood her, and she knew that this person was the one she needed. Tom didn't try to talk her into doing anything in return, but he just gave her the attention that had long since disappeared from her life. They stood there for a long time, looking at each other in silence. Emily felt something inside her change, as if an old wall were falling down, and something new was left in its place, something she couldn't explain. This moment was so simple and so meaningful that she realized she wanted Tom to be there. "Maybe we could just go for a walk," Tom suggested. "I think you need some air." She nodded, and they both walked out of the building, getting some fresh air. They walked silently through the night city, sometimes touching each other casually, and the silence was not painful, but surprisingly light. She felt that perhaps for the first time in a long time someone was hearing and understanding her. At some point Tom stopped, and she noticed that they were standing in a park lit by the soft light of lanterns. It was quiet, and only occasionally the echoes of the city could be heard. Tom turned to her, and his eyes were serious. "Emily, I know it's not easy, and maybe it all seems wrong." He said it quietly, almost in a whisper, but there was such sincerity in his voice that she couldn't take her eyes off. "I know you're stuck in the past, but maybe it's time to think about yourself. Maybe you deserve to be happy now, not live in memories." Emily felt her eyes wet again. Tom's words seemed to penetrate the depths of her soul, touching the string she had been trying to ignore for so long. "Tom," she barely heard, felt her voice tremble. "I'm afraid that if I take this step, I'll lose everything I had. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm afraid I'm going to destroy everything that Steve and I have been building all these years." This moment was what she had been going for all this time, and now, in his arms, she felt free at last. "Sometimes to find yourself, you have to take a risk and leave the past behind," Tom said softly. "I'm not asking you to make a choice. I'm just asking you to think about yourself, what makes you happy," because those words, spoken in a quiet park, were the key to her heart, and Emily tried to get back to normal life, but her conversation with Tom, his words, it was all stuck in her mind like a bait. Now every day was filled with this new feeling, like wanting to wake up from sleep, but also the fear of loss. Emily felt her usual life beginning to crumble, like a worn-out building that had been holding on to momentum for a long time. Tom tried not to cross the line they both had been quietly trying to establish, but despite his restraint, every time they met, Emily saw in him a quiet fire that made her heart beat harder again. She knew that she couldn't go back, that this step, their late walks, their secret conversations, was the beginning of something inevitable. One day after work, Tom suddenly offered her a cup of coffee in a small coffee shop, hidden from the outside world. Emily knew that agreeing to it was another step towards something she had been trying so hard to protect herself from. But the desire to be near him overcame all her fears and doubts. She nodded, and they headed to a quiet coffee shop where the lights were dimmed and the atmosphere was intimate. Tom was saying something, but she caught herself thinking that she wasn't listening to him. Her thoughts were somewhere far away. His presence meant more to her than all the talk, as if she had been waiting for this person in her life for a long time and only now realized that he could really be the one to give her what she had been deprived of for so long. At some point, Tom stopped and looked at her so closely that she caught her breath. He leaned a little closer, and she felt his breath on her face. Everything they hadn't dared to say to each other was now being read in their eyes, and the tension in the air became unbearable. She knew that this moment was crucial, and all that remained in her mind was the desire to cross over all her fears and doubts, and she nodded as if to agree with him. And in that moment he gently took her hand, and he almost squeezed her fingers, and his touch was a revelation to her. She felt a sense of freedom and happiness that she hadn't felt in a long time, and she felt that she was willing to risk everything to be with this man. And in that moment, sitting in the half-dark coffee shop across from Tom, Emily felt the gap between her past and her future growing deeper. But now, instead of being frightened, she felt a new sense of security, and when they went outside, Emily still held his hand, and the night was warm, and the air was a little chilly like a hint of something new. Tom held her hand, and they walked slowly down the deserted streets, enjoying this moment, their first real moment of intimacy that didn't require words. "It's never been easier," she confessed, and I stopped and looked him in the eye. "Tom, with you I feel alive." He smiled, and she realized that these words meant much more to him than a simple compliment. Tom hugged her carefully, and Emily felt his hands wrapped around her, creating a protective shell around her. Everything she had known before, everything she had lived through in the past years, seemed to have disappeared like a melting mirage. In this embrace, she felt calm and easy, as if she had finally found what she had always been looking for. And if I could be a part of that, I would be happy, because she had this feeling that she couldn't explain, that it was like a dream, but the reality was that she was making this choice. She was choosing to go down this path, and Emily knew that her life was going to go in a completely different direction, and she wasn't scared. Instead, she felt that she had finally found herself, and they walked for a long time through the night city, sometimes in silence, sometimes exchanging soft phrases that didn't require answers. She knew that they were both ready for what was to come, and that perhaps for the first time in her life, she was finding the strength to fight for her happiness. As they said goodbye, Emily stood there for a long time, gazing at him, and suddenly she realized that this evening had changed everything. She knew that she would never be able to return to her old life, and that she would have to make a difficult choice. But now she had no fear, only a quiet, confident sense that she was moving in the right direction. A month had passed since Emily and Tom began their secret meetings. Their short walks, dinners away from the public eye, and quiet conversations in the empty corners of the office had become for her a breath of fresh air that she had long been deprived of. During this time, her life seemed to have split into two parallel worlds. One was familiar, cold, formal, with her husband barely noticing her presence, and the other alive and filled with Tom. These meetings became what she had been waiting for every day. But now Emily knew that the balance was held on a thin thread that could be broken at any moment. She knew that she would soon have to make a decision. Continuing her relationship with Tom was dangerous, not so much because of the fear of being exposed, but because it was destroying her inner world. She couldn't lie to Steve anymore, and especially to herself, and she was tormented by the realization that their marriage had essentially become an empty shell, which they maintained more by habit than love. One night Steve invited her to dinner, which was a surprise in itself. She couldn't remember the last time they had just dined together outside the house. They chose a cozy restaurant in the middle of town with dim lights and live music, which brought back memories of the early years of their relationship. And sitting across from it, Emily tried to remember what had once attracted her to it. Its confidence, its determination, its sense of humor. She stared at him for a long time, as if trying to catch something familiar in his face, and suddenly she felt a gap between them that she hadn't noticed before. Steve tried to have a light conversation, asking about her work, but Emily seemed to be more polite. She answered him, trying to seem interested, but each of his questions seemed to emphasize how far apart they were. And at some point she caught his gaze and saw the sincerity in his eyes that shocked her. I was so wrapped up in my work, we didn't talk much, and I realized it was my fault. I lost sight of what was important to us, you. She froze, not believing her ears. These words were a revelation for her that she never expected. I want you to be happy again, and we can get back what we lost. Emily felt the warmth in her chest rise, but at the same time she felt the regret. Why did he say this only now? Why did it take him so many years to realize that she lacked his attention, his care? Steve, she started, not knowing the right words. I don't know if we could do it. We've been together for so long, but I feel like we've lost what was before. I'm not sure I could be the same again. She saw the pain in his eyes, and it almost physically hurt her, but something inside her kept telling her that it would be the same. She knew that their marriage would never be the same, and that it was her own decision, and she had been going for weeks, and Steve leaned over and took her hand and said quietly, "Emily, I love you. I know I haven't shown it for years, but it is true. I just don't want to lose you." She always wanted to hear it from him, always wanted to feel that he really appreciated her, but now that he finally opened up, it wasn't like that anymore. There was a feeling between them that couldn't be expressed in simple words. She shook his hand in response, but she didn't say anything. This moment, when she could have drowned sooner, now seemed to her burdened with something bigger than herself. That night, she couldn't sleep for long. Her mind was spinning about Steve, about Tom, about the life she had built and which was now in danger of collapsing. She thought the decision had been made, but it was complicated by Steve talking about feelings she hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, she met Tom, as usual. They went out for a walk during the break, and Emily couldn't contain the internal tension, which had become almost unbearable. Tom sensed her condition and stopped, looking at her seriously. "Emily, is something wrong?" he asked quietly. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts, and decided to tell him everything. "Tom, I don't know what to do," she began, trying to find the words. "Steve, he wants to try to make things right. He says he still loves me, but I'm not sure I can go back, that I can be with him like I used to." Tom listened to her in silence, and in his eyes she saw understanding, but also hidden pain. She knew that Tom was drawing her in like someone new, who was giving her the warmth and attention she had been deprived of. But at the same time, she knew that she was connected to Steve. "I feel like I want to be happy, and that maybe I've waited too long for this happiness," she said, looking Tom straight in the eye. "But I can't just walk away. I can't destroy everything that Steve and I had." Tom nodded, and his face took on a serious expression. He touched her hand gently, and he put his hand on her chest, and he said, "Emily, I'll always be there, even if you decide to stay with him. Just know that you have a choice, and that you deserve to be happy, no matter how you decide." She felt like she could make a choice because she really had a choice, and it gave her strength, and a few days later, Emily and Steve talked again. and she told him that she was feeling lonely, that she was looking for support and understanding, which he couldn't give her. She didn't tell him the truth about Tom, but she made it clear that she needed something more than just a formal marriage. Steve listened carefully, and in his eyes she saw pain, but also acceptance. "If you really feel like you need to leave, I won't hold you," he said quietly. "I want you to be happy, even if it's without me." Those words finally put everything in place. Emily realized that her choice was predestined. She wanted to start over, and even though this new path seemed scary to her, she knew she was ready for it. She said goodbye to Steve that night, leaving behind everything that connected them. This conversation was painful for her, but it was also liberating. She knew that she was beginning a new phase in her life where she could finally be herself. The next day she met Tom and looked him in the eye and said, "I've made a decision. I want to start with you." Tom smiled, his eyes glowing with happiness and warmth. He hugged her, and in that moment she felt she had made the right choice, that her life was starting over, that she had new challenges ahead of her, but that she knew she would always follow her heart.